In the Gospel today, Jesus paints a word picture of children playing. First, they pretend to be at a wedding. Weddings were joyful occasions in which the whole company joined, with eating and drinking, when the music started, with dancing. But in this game, when someone had played the pipe, no one had danced. Then it was a funeral being acted out, with its solemn rituals in which again the whole community would have been caught up. And again, although someone had sung the dirges, the others hadn't joined in with the expected signs of mourning. Jesus is talking all this to a crowd, the public as it were. Weddings and funerals would have been familiar to them as they are to us. So why use this illustration? John the Baptist was in prison and had sent some of his disciples to Jesus to ask if he really was the Messiah. Jesus asked them to look at the evidence for themselves. What have you seen me do? What have you heard me say? Go back and tell John. And so they went. And then Jesus spoke about these children at play. It's almost as if he is saying that sometimes you just can't get it right. John the Baptist had taken on the traditional role of the prophet, living in the desert, dressed in a certain way, and encouraging people who thought of themselves as the people of God to actually get back to God and take his ways of living seriously. A message many of the Old Testament prophets had reiterated. You might say it's heavy language, a solemn message, a necessary message, like a funeral almost. Then Jesus comes, living in the community as an ordinary man, eating and drinking with all sorts, and taking every opportunity to share the inclusive and all-embracing love and acceptance of God for them. Again, a necessary message, but seemingly much more light and joyful. A wedding almost. And from the state and religious leaders as well as many of the ordinary folk, there was a negative response. Neither message of John or Jesus was acceptable. They were not willing to examine themselves in the light of God's revelation to them, nor accept his unconditional love. Both John and Jesus were executed. But of course, when the Holy Spirit is at work, as in Jesus and John, that wasn't the end. The truth goes on, and we today are the beneficiaries of both John's and Jesus' ministries. John had been preparing people whose history was bound up with God to receive Jesus and his truth, that relationship with God is open to all people. To receive Jesus, who we know as the Son of God, God actually himself living as one of us. It's interesting that Jesus used children in this parable. Now, children had no social standing in that culture. They had no party alliances, so didn't pose any threats to adults. On one occasion, when those who should have known better were arguing about their individual importance, Jesus sat a child on his knee and told them that they needed to become like that child to understand what living God's way is like. I've often wondered what becoming childlike really means. Until adults show or teach them otherwise, children entrust themselves completely to others, accept them regardless of any cultural or religious differences. But then they have to do that because they are not self-sufficient, so much depend on others. I'm sure that there are other characteristics of children that can help us to understand more what it means to live God's way. John's message in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets might have been interpreted as, you know the rules about living God's way, get back to them. 2,000 years on, we also know those rules, such as loving our enemies and turning the other cheek, but still find it hard to live by them. We may have been brought up as Christians, as I was, with lots of things we ought to do, or should do, or indeed shouldn't do, almost as if we can earn favour with God. And how hard as we try, it is difficult to do what we know what is right. St. Paul had the same problem. He did things he shouldn't and didn't do things he knew he should. In that sense, Our life is governed by rules, and it's like carrying a very heavy load around. Jesus' message was first one of the acceptance and unconditional love of God for each of us, regardless of whether the rules have been kept or broken. And that's not a heavy load. Then, in receiving that love and responding to it, people found themselves wanting to live God's way, to keep the rules. Relationship with God and knowledge of His love drove that desire. It is that love of God which compels us to come in and also compels us to reach out. Amen.